Hello, Internet. Evan Benton here. This is another video of or pertaining to the coronavirus. This is going to be a bit different from the last couple. So we'll just see what the Internet thinks of it. I wrote out a script, so I'll just read that and we'll just see. Alright? This video is going to deal with esoteric subject matter and may not be compatible with all worldviews. I am a Christian, although I haven't always been one. In fact, it was my research into the world of the occult that eventually led me to accept the truth of the Gospels. I won't belabor the point here, but I became a Christian when I realized that the world was controlled by a group of satanic pedophiles. When I realized the extent to which media and academia regularly mocked Christianity, even mocking very specific elements of Christianity, such as the virgin birth and crucifixion, I started to think there might be something there. Now, I am not a theologian, and I probably never will be, so don't ask me to defend this claim. But I do believe that one of the areas in which Christian cosmology is superior is in its conception of good and evil. The idea of good and evil that is put forth in our modern pop culture is a dialectical one, meaning that good and evil oppose one another and balance each other out. Batman has his Joker, Harry Potter has his Lord Voldemort, and there is a force consisting of a light and a dark side. Evil, so it goes, only becomes truly bad when it is out of balance, at which point heroes arrive to save the day and restore the status quo. Now, the main problem with this dialectical concept of good and evil is that it keeps us trapped. The distinction between the two is basically arbitrary or subjective, and it becomes a matter of picking a team rather than deciding how we ought to act. It's good for movies and TV shows because the audience knows that at the end of the story, the cosmic balance will be restored, setting the stage for a sequel or another episode. However, it's basically inconsequential, meaning that the consequences of the choices a person makes rarely, if ever, carry over into the next story arc. It doesn't allow growth because there's nowhere to grow from and nowhere to grow to. So basically, the dialectical concept of good versus evil is perfect for keeping us in a state of perpetual childhood. It keeps us glued to our seats, waiting for the next installment. It's basically addictive because it doesn't provide us with a really fulfilling explanation of how the world works and how our actions influence it. Christianity, on the other hand, it has a very concise and I would argue practical concept of good and evil. God, the Creator, is good, while rejection or rebellion against God is evil. The problem is that we humans are incapable of truly telling good from evil due to our limited understanding, which is why God incarnated as a man in the person of Jesus Christ in order to teach us. So, by grace, through faith, we can follow the will of God. And even though the true reward for our goodness is not to be found in this limited life on earth, because God is good, we can see that when we emulate Him, our lives on earth and the lives of the people around us get better. This gets us off the couch and out of the dialectical loop, learning, growing, building, and raising our children to hopefully be better off than we were. It actually allows progress, which is somewhat ironic when you consider it in contrast with the worldview of the so-called progressives. Now, as an aside here, let's look at the original sin. In Genesis chapter 3, we read, "Now the serpent was more crafty than any of the wild animals the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, 'Did God really say, you must not eat from any tree in the garden?' The woman said to the serpent, 'We may eat from the trees in the garden, but God did say, you must not eat fruit from the tree that is in the middle of the garden, and you must not touch it, or you will die.' 'You will not certainly die,' the serpent said to the woman, 'for God knows that when you eat from it your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. The important thing to notice here is that this is a trick. The serpent, who is Satan, is tempting Eve with the knowledge of good and evil, knowing that she won't actually attain it. But there is the idea in esoteric circles that humanity, having eaten the forbidden fruit, now has this knowledge. We were innocent children in paradise, and now we are responsible adults in the world. This gives rise to the idea that when we sin, we learn something that we wouldn't have learned except by sinning. And so we have the kind of back and forth between good and evil that some people and some religions believe lead to a state called enlightenment. The proof that this is a lie comes from the fact that we die. Satan said, "You will not certainly die," and yet we do die. There was no death prior to the original sin in Christian cosmology. Remember, Adam and Eve were not prevented from eating of the tree of life. So again, it was all a trick. We really gain nothing by sinning according to Christianity. On the other hand, though, we have Genesis chapter 3, verse 22, where we read, "And the Lord God said, the man has now become like one of us, knowing good and evil. He must not be allowed to reach out his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat, and live forever." These same esoteric circles will point to this passage and say, aha, God is afraid of us now because Satan liberated him and taught him the knowledge that will enable him to be like us. This is where the symbolism of 322 comes from, by the way. And the original Hebrew does say, man has become as one of us. But look at the context. Man reacts to this so-called knowledge with shame. He covers up his nakedness. Is this the behavior of a would-be God? Did God create the universe in shame? Of course not. So evil is not this noble thing. It's actually shameful, something to hide. So in Christianity then, evil is not necessary. We don't have to sow our wild oats or get it out of our system. God did not create us to experience what he had created and report back to him. He created us as an expression of his goodness, because that's what goodness is. Creation. There are actually infinite ways of being good, whereas the number of ways there are of being evil are limited, which is very interesting to think about. Okay, with that little definition out of the way, I'm going to move on to an epiphany I had the other day. So science tells us that viruses are not technically alive because they can't reproduce on their own. Viruses, in other words, are something on the edge of life. And then, having dropped this major bombshell, scientists go on as though that were a satisfactory definition of viruses. But really, what does that mean? What is life? Where did it come from? What is the edge of it? Are viruses zombies? Then really, what is a zombie? So these are big, big questions that obviously science can't answer, and yet we've collectively given it the authority to make these life-altering proclamations about how to behave and when to shut down schools and so forth. I mentioned in my previous video that there is some controversy over AIDS and HIV. If you look into it, you'll find that the controversy is about whether HIV and actually all other viruses even exist. And people who make the claim that they don't are typically ridiculed and called conspiracy theorists. The thing is, though, that viruses don't just exist at the fringes of what we think life is. They're also at the fringes of what science can tell us about the world. They're at the limit of what our instruments can detect. Even the electron microscope images we have of them can't tell us much about what they are or how they work. The way that scientists actually study viruses is by breaking them apart and examining the way that their constituent chemicals interact with other chemicals. So basically, when we talk about viruses, we're talking about the frontiers of scientific research and theory, and we are all well within our rights to speculate about their existence. Okay, so what do we know about viruses? Viruses were discovered in 1892 when Russian biologist Dmitry Ivanovsky took the sap out of a diseased tobacco plant, passed it through a filter to remove everything larger than a single-celled organism, and injected it into a healthy tobacco plant. The healthy plant got sick as well, and so he knew that there was something infectious in the sap. Originally, scientists assumed that the liquid itself was infectious, but in 1946, American Wendell Stanley isolated viral RNA from an infectious tobacco sap, demonstrating that small particles were involved in the transmission. Along the way, it was repeatedly demonstrated that viruses could not be grown in sterile media, as was the case for most bacteria. In other words, they required a living host. Now, for the most part, the genetic material that makes up a virus comes in the form of RNA. It's true in most cases that an RNA molecule comprises a single strand of information, while a DNA molecule comprises a double strand of information. But of course, it's a lot more complicated than that. For the sake of my argument, I'm going to briefly describe the process of protein biosynthesis, which is the way that so-called higher forms of life use DNA to generate the proteins they use to build cells and basically do stuff in life. I think most people are actually fairly familiar with this process, but here it goes. Firstly, that double helix of DNA we've all seen is unzipped into two single strands of RNA. Next, the RNA is cut up into functional units known as genes, and these genes, in a form known as messenger RNA, is sent out of the nucleus into the main part of the cell. Once there, parts of the cell known as ribosomes assemble amino acids according to the directions specified by the messenger RNA into all the different proteins that make up the cell. So looking at the role of RNA in that process, we can see that viruses are essentially an incomplete version of an organism, a life form. They can't reproduce because they don't have all the parts. They can't make anything. This raises the question, where do viruses stand in comparison to things that are fully alive? Are they something which is in the process of becoming alive, or are they the remnants of something which was once alive? This really has vast implications for our understanding of the universe. Because if viruses are on their way to becoming alive, that supports the random chance theory of mainstream cosmology. There was some Big Bang event which led to the formation of matter from energy, and now we can see the emergence of life from matter. The name for that concept is emergence or emergence theory, something coming out of nothing. This is actually the foundation of every bizarre theory in every field, from physics to sociology. If you arrange a system according to a particular set of rules, a whole new system with a new set of rules will arise from it. So if you put a bunch of neurons together, eventually you'll get this new thing called consciousness. If you put a bunch of people together, eventually you'll get this new thing called religion. If you put a bunch of metal and rubber together, eventually you'll get this new thing called a bicycle. It's the 1,000 monkeys typing at 1,000 typewriters argument. Emergence is where we get the slogan, order out of chaos, which is a strategy of destabilizing a population through war or drugs, or maybe a disease, hint hint, and then managing the response to that destabilization in order to bring about a specific outcome. The problem with emergence theory is that, first of all, it's never been demonstrated, and second, it begs the question of where everything came from to begin with, which is a question known as prime cause, or the unmoved mover. Now, if, on the other hand, viruses are remnants of cells, or if they're part of some reproductive process, kind of like how certain plants will alternate between haploid and diploid generations, then that tells us that life as we know it was actually originally more complex than it is now, rather than less complex. And that leads us to the idea of a transcendent personal creator, which again has vast implications for our understanding of the universe. So the idea of a God is actually very cool and useful because it gets us out of that trap of randomness. It gives us the idea that there is a purpose to the universe, and therefore there can be a purpose to our lives and all the suffering we might have to go through, even or especially though we might not know what that purpose is. A final distinction that we have to make between good and evil is that evil cannot create. Evil only twists and corrupts. The best example I can think of this is in The Lord of the Rings, when they show the orcs being pulled out of mud pits. The voiceover explains that orcs are made from elves and humans in some kind of alchemical process. However, the whole idea of evil is that it wants to be good. It wants to create. The whole reason that Satan rebelled against God and took a third of the angels with him is that he thought he could do a better job of creation than God could. So what we're doing as Christians is we're trying to preserve the good that God has given us. We're trying to be good stewards of the land. In the Eastern concept of chi, it's actually the same. In Japanese, if you want to ask, how are you, you say, o genki desu ka, which basically translates as, how is your original chi? Genki means original chi, and if you have your original chi, you are healthy. So Eastern medicine is basically all about preserving and restoring the patient's original chi. Now, chi has an element of causality to it as well. For example, I have some rocks and flower pots on my front porch. Sometimes some leaves will get blown into the spaces between those rocks and flower pots, and I'll have to clean them out. Scientific materialism tells us that this is simply caused by the interaction between various particles and so forth. The difference between hot and cold air creates wind, which blows the leaves up onto my front porch where the rocks and flower pots trap them. The Eastern metaphysical concept, though, would tell us that the specific configuration of rocks and flower pots is stagnating the qi in the area, which is then attracting the leaves. Incidentally, the Chinese study of geomancy, or feng shui, tells us that a little bit of stagnation around the front door of your house is good because it slows the qi down and keeps it from rushing into your house. Now, I have gotten very far afield, and I want to return the question of where viruses come from. Another great thing about Christianity is that it acknowledges that there are all kinds of spirits in the world. The great distinction that Christianity makes, as opposed to, say, Taoism, is that most of these spirits are evil. The Bible actually gives us a way to tell whether a spirit is good or evil in 1 John chapter 4, where it says, "Every spirit that confesses that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is from God, and every spirit that does not confess that Jesus Christ is come in the flesh is not from God." That is to say, in Christian cosmology, spirits exist, and they can be either good or evil. So in terms of viruses, we have very small particles which are having some effect on life. The question is, where did they come from? Now, I won't be the first person to propose that some viruses have a metaphysical origin in evil spirits, also known as demons, but I had an epiphany into the nature of that origin. Think about a haunted house, like really, a house with some evil presence in it. I thank God that I have no first-hand experience with that sort of thing, but the eyewitness accounts speak of things moving on their own. Foul smells, the air suddenly gets very cold, but especially doors opening and closing, candles being blown out, sheets being pulled off, etc. The idea in Christianity is that these hauntings are not the ghosts of someone who died there, but a demon, which has basically possessed an object or a place. According to Christianity, these demons actually have very little power in the material world, so they're limited to moving small objects. Now, you see where I'm going here. Viruses are very small. Nanoscale, in fact, which is a hint as to where that technology may lead. So, if there are such things as demons, and if they are capable of moving a Ouija planchette or a pendulum, then naturally they will find it much easier to stitch together a Frankenstein's monster of a virus out of cellular debris. Again, this would not be an act of creation, but really zombification of genetic material. Now you take that concept and look at things like witches, or the very old school of germ warfare, where they were taking yucky stuff and hurling it over castle walls or putting it in wells. They didn't know how it worked, they only knew that it worked, as if by magic. In fact, what picture does the word witch conjure up other than an old hag bent over her cauldron, stirring up a pot of witch's brew, which is basically composed of all the yucky stuff she can find thrown in a pot? This is known as sympathetic magic. Now, with that concept of the witch's brew in mind, I'm not saying you should look at how vaccines are made, but you should look at how vaccines are made. So in closing, when we're talking about viruses, we have to understand that we're talking about the very limits of science. If someone says something outlandish, therefore, we can't be so quick to dismiss it. The science is not settled, as it were. Religion, on the other hand, and metaphysics has some very interesting things to say on the subject. And if there really are bioweapons floating around, as I believe there are, we really need to look at the belief systems of the people who would actually develop them. We have to remember, as I kept reminding myself when I first started studying the occult, that it doesn't really matter whether any of this stuff is real. What matters is that there are people with a lot of power who apparently believe that it's real. Okay, well that is all for my video. So I really would like to hear what people have to say about that. Please share, please like, and subscribe. This has been Evan Benton of Dogg from Air.